This is the July 27th, 2021 meeting of the City Committee on Legislation. And may I have a roll call, Mr. Ford?
Certainly. Committee Member Sneddon.
Here.
Committee Member Harmon.
Here.
And Chair Friedman.
Here. We are all present, and so we'll go on to item 1 on the agenda, and this is for public comment. This is for public comment for items not on today's agenda. So is there any member of the public who wishes to speak during regular public comment? Please raise your hand in the app.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll give it 1 second. We have 3 attendees on for public comment.
I'm not seeing any, and you're not either, Mr. Ford.
Let me give it 1 more second. If anybody's here who's here to speak on items that are not related to formal agenda items, please raise your hand. I'm not seeing anybody.
Yeah, we'll close general public comment, and we will move on to item 2, which is to the review of the purpose and contents of the city's legislative platform. And before I turn it over, just a general oversight of this item is that we are doing an overview of the legislative platform that the city previously adopted and going over that. And then also as part of that, Mr. Ford, if you could go into the process for how the council can opine on state or federal legislation as part of the review of the platform. And I will turn it over to you, Mr. Ford. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I would like to go over the city's legislative platform, and I want to spend a little bit of time because I think, you know, it's been a while since we've really addressed the contents and the purpose of the legislative platform. I think one of the ways to explain what the legislative platform is to describe it in comparison to our previous process, and that may help highlight the purpose. So just to talk about the purpose of the platform, back in, probably several years ago, 10, 15 years ago or so, the city council, if the city council wanted to take a formal position on a bill that was making its way through the legislature, it did so by adopting a formal resolution of the city council. And as you're aware, that's a fairly time-consuming and cumbersome process. There are, it's writing the actual resolution, writing a staff report, getting it on in the admin portion of a council agenda. There are 2 or 3 weeks of lead time for that. Sometimes council is dark for various reasons. And so the city, along with many other cities back at that time, were really constrained and unable to be nimble and respond to various pieces of legislation or take advocacy positions on those bills as they moved out of their house of origin to committees and onto the governor's desk. And so the city wasn't new in this. Many cities across California and the nation, for that matter, have taken a different approach, and that's to adopt a legislative platform like what we have. And I'll get into what it is, but this legislative platform, and in our case, is 37 pages of various positions on various pieces of policy, ranging from all kinds of things, from taxation to local control to housing policy and even social issues. And so by having that legislative platform that the city council formally adopts, they'll formally adopt this legislative platform, the city council has then empowered the mayor to take various advocacy positions that are consistent with that legislative platform on any number of bills that come up in any given legislative session. And as you're aware, in this most recent or the current legislative session, there are over 2,000 bills that were introduced. And so you can imagine the difficulty and the time-consuming process that would be involved in the city council adopting formal resolutions on 2,000 bills or what have you. So a lot of this is, the public side of the legislative platform is the revision, the periodic revision of the legislative platform. The formal adoption by the city council, that's the public facing piece of this. Those revisions are considered by this legislative committee and then recommended to the city council as a formal action. That's the public side. The behind the scenes side then is that as these bills get introduced into the legislature in a given legislative session, staff is then preparing any number of letters for the mayor to sign that takes a position that's consistent with the platform that the full council, all 7 members have adopted. So that kind of in a nutshell is the purpose. And I want to stop there for a second and show you a little bit about the legislative platform and where it is. So I'm going to switch gears here and go onto the city's website. And so I want to make sure that you're seeing what I'm seeing. So this is the city's legislative committee page. And down at the bottom where it says legislative program, this is the city's legislative platform. And I just got a message that some of you didn't get the link. So I'm gonna resend this to you, to all of you. Okay. All right, I just resent it. But as you can see, it was last formally adopted, revised by the City Council in June of 2019. Typically, we go through a revision process at least once every 2 years, sometimes annually. And really it's driven by what's happening, what's happening in the world, what's happening in terms of legislative trends and which way the legislature is going on various things. But that's where you'll find it. And so you all now have the link and you can see where it is. But what it addresses, like I said, it's 37 pages of policy positions on various things. Some pages are broken out into various departments, some are broken out into themes. And I won't go through this exhaustively. I just want you to see things like local authority and discretion. This is a big one. You'll see this thread wrap its way through almost the entire legislative platform. That's a big one. The city of Santa Barbara as a charter city, maintaining and preserving its authority in various policy decisions by the state. Other things like unfunded mandates and the Brown Act, even elections and government transparency and ethics. That's part of that. And then, as we get further into it, fiscal policy and taxation and things like that. Sales and use taxes, even cannabis taxes were one of the things that we recently added. Many times the legislative platform is, the changes, the revisions, as I said, it's kind of natural. It's driven by what's happening in the world, what's happening to us as a city, what's happening to the state, and then also what's happening in the legislature. So we've seen in the past, I went back and looked at a couple of revisions over the years, things that were drivers that really drove revisions, things like housing policy. And as you recall, a couple years ago, this 35 bill or 15 bill housing policy package by Senator Wiener, that starting with SB35, that was a big one, right? That was a big policy shift. And so we saw pretty substantial revisions to our legislative platform in response to things like that, because it looked like that wasn't going to be a one-off legislative action. That was going to be a trend for the foreseeable future. Other drivers, things like drought and drought policy and conservation, things like that. Other things are as you can imagine, things like emerging initiatives like CCE, community choice aggregation, or community choice energy in our case. So new initiatives where the city's taking on new enterprises like procuring its own power supplies, and the interplay between CCEs and the Public Utilities Commission and the investor-owned utilities. Those are things that were drivers of changes. Also things like offshore oil drilling were another set of things. So we change this, the take-home messages, we update the legislative platform about every year or two. We didn't do it this year. It's a very, very staff-intensive endeavor to do so. And during COVID and during the lockdown, that's not something that we undertook. We do plan to do that, and it's probably more like in the fall this year. Normally, we do this in the spring, so we have an updated platform for the late spring and early summer of the legislative session. It was just pretty difficult to do during the lockdown. So it's something we'll get back on. But as you can see, we have a very, very robust legislative platform that goes page after page of workers' comp, public safety, nuisances, lots on public safety, fire, and certainly environmental quality and sustainability and environmental positions is a big one. Planning and community development, lots on planning and community development in our legislative platform. And then certainly as we get toward the end of the document, waterfront and things related to the ocean and all the things that come with that. And so I just wanted to, in this session, briefly talk what's the purpose, where do you find it, what's the process for updating it, and how do we use it. And so, so we use this platform and we write letters. Staff prepares letters for the mayor to sign all the time. And so how do these come in? Well, number of sources. There are a number of things that drive the letters that we write on behalf of the mayor every year. One source is through the League of Cities. The city is a member of the League of Cities. Mr. Dave Molinax is here today, and he'll be speaking on a few high priority bills. But the League of Cities tracks, they kind of help cities cull through the 2,500 bills that come up and say, these are the ones of particular interest. Some are more relevant than others. Some are much more relevant to the city of Santa Barbara than to say other cities like, Victorville on the high desert or something like that. But a lot of these have cross-cutting implications where we may take a unified approach. So that's one, certainly the League of Cities. The other one though is every department has a legislative liaison that is familiar with its pieces of the legislative platform, and through industry groups and every discipline has its own other industry groups that are tracking legislation. So we hear from staff and the departments all the time on things that come up under their purview, and so they'll be giving us things to prepare for the mayor. And then you all, the city council is certainly feeding us bills of interest and saying, hey, is this addressed in our legislative platform? If it's not, could we add that to the list of potential revisions for the next time around? So there are a number of sources, and certainly the city attorney's office through their annual legislative update to city council is front and center and a big driver in the types of things that we keep our eyes on as well. So 3 or 4 primary sources of information that inform the kinds of letters that we're preparing. But in all cases, the very first question that we ask is this bill, is the position being advocated by staff, by city council members, by industry groups, is it consistent with the city's legislative platform? And so when a department, for example, sends me a bill, I say, please show me, please highlight in the legislative platform how this is consistent with what council has formally adopted. And if it is, then we prepare the letter, and then the mayor again is empowered to take that position on behalf of the city. So in the agenda packet, just as an example, let me grab my notes here. In the agenda packet, based upon the last meeting in May, this committee agreed that we should send letters on a number of bills. And I attached those letters to your packet that I can't find at the moment, but AB 897 I think was one, SB1, SB 556. Those were letters that are addressed. Those policy issues are addressed in the legislative platform, and it was an easy thing to do. The other thing to say is, it's a rare exception. It's a rare exception through these 37 pages of policy positions. It's a rare exception where a bill comes up where the city has not taken a position on a bill. Where there are those cases, those are ones that we would refer to this committee and then have the committee, if it so chose, to make a recommendation and a referral to council. But in my 10 years being here at the city, it's fairly rare that a bill comes up where, if you look through this entire legislative platform, the city is silent on a position. So it works, and that's the other message, is this legislative platform works. It allows the city to be nimble. It allows us to write on behalf of the mayor a whole litany of bills in every legislative session. And so, let me check my notes one more time. And then just to follow up, in speaking with Chair Friedman, one of the next steps in relation to this committee as your staff liaison is to convene you once again sometime in the fall to finish off the work that we began just when the lockdown was happening back in March of 2020. And that's to bring to you for consideration the next set of revisions to this legislative platform. It won't be a complete overhaul. We've built incrementally, but we do have some incremental revisions that we want to discuss with this committee. All departments will discuss with this committee, and we'll be asking you to refer those to council with recommendations on inclusion in the next update. So it's something that we're a little bit behind on, but we'd like to catch up, and that'll put us in really good position. If we get that done, say between October and December, it'll put us in a real prime position going into the next legislative session. So I think, Chair Friedman, I can answer questions, but I think that's the end of my.
Thank you, Mr. Four. Just a couple clarifications before I open up to questions from my colleagues. One is appreciate reference to the next meeting. So that would be to look at updates that we weren't able to do this year due to the pandemic. And then those would go to council and they would be included in our, there would be a public process as well. The public would have a chance to review the draft and opine on it as well. It doesn't just come to Leg Committee. We make the decisions. We do outreach to the community through this process. And then it would go to council. And then as part of that meeting as well, you and I had discussed also looking at the process for the legislative committee and whether it is time to look at potentially updating that process for how we review legislation, being that there tends to be more frequent bills and higher stakes in Sacramento right now in particular, and whether instead of meeting once a year or once every 2 years to update the platform, whether we would meet a couple times a year depending on legislation, and at least to get updates on legislation. So that would be a fall meeting. And then the other thing I just wanted to clarify from you is we, as a council, have not funded a legislative analyst position. Is that correct, Mr. Ford?
That's correct. Not a specific legislative analyst. It's just it's a duty that currently is assigned to me, but we don't have a full-time position or even a half-time position for that.
And so the system we have now with this platform and the ability to be nimble, and then also to have periodic meetings like these, is one of the reasons within our funding. Our lack of our decision not to fund a legislative analyst, but we use the resources of the League of Cities, Mr. Molnix is here, and others to fill those gaps. And then the last question I just have in terms of process is, as a council member for any of the 7 of us out there, if we're out in the community and there are certain bills that we would like the city to send a letter on, whether it be there's a lot of movement on housing bills, of course, and then there's climate change, sea level rise, wildfires. How would a member of council present to staff? How would they bring it forward to say, hey, is this within our legislative platform? And can we send a letter through the mayor on behalf of the city? How would a council member do that?
Yeah, just as described. So, so I get it in two ways. What in some cases, council members will say, hey, I looked at the legislative platform. I think this is the plank that supports this position. Great. Others say, I don't know, you look through all 37 pages, tell me. That's perfectly fine. So the process can be, you can send your bill of interest to me and say, can you tell me if this is addressed in the legislative platform and how? Would the city be taking a position in opposition or support of this particular bill? In some cases, just like the League of Cities does, other groups do, many times there are sample letters that are written that they say, you can use this as a template and then tailor it specifically to your city. And we'll do that to give it more of a City of Santa Barbara flavor. That works perfectly, and I'd be glad to continue that service.
Okay, so a council member could reach out to you to discuss any specific bills of interest and how that would work. And then when the mayor sends the letter, it's on behalf of the council adopted legislative platform, so it carries the weight of the council. It's not just the mayor opining; it's the council.
Absolutely. And this, I'll get into more detail on this when it's formally agendized. So not to speak to the contents, but one of the other things in agendizing the process discussion in late fall, one of the things that we're prepared to do, and I'll do this in the staff report for that meeting, is to suggest some key times, some key milestones when this committee may want to meet, to look at positions or just to get updates. And so, the way that the legislative process goes, in our case, 2,000 bills are introduced. That's probably a bit overwhelming, but there are key milestones when those get culled out, right? They get culled down. And so we may want to look at which ones make it out of the House of Origin, which ones get referred to committee for consideration. Those are two good milestones. And then finally, the big push for sign or veto when they make it out of both houses and go to the governor's desk. So those might be some critical points that we'll suggest as a calendar, and I'll work with Mr. Molinax on that. But in advance of that, or in the staff report, we might suggest a couple of critical milestones that will help ensure that this group's time and focus are really maximized, right? So that when you do meet, you don't have to meet all the time, but when you do, it's very worthwhile.
Very strategic, and that'll be a discussion at the next fall meeting that you and I had discussed on how to be more strategic and maximize the effectiveness of this committee in particular. And so those are the questions that I have. So I'll open up to questions from my colleagues, Councilmember Sp9.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Thank you, Mr. Four. I am really grateful for this presentation. I've actually been asking for 3.5 years what the process is, and I've asked in public forum from the dais, I've asked independently, administrators, and I did not understand, and I don't believe other council members understand, that we are to come directly to you, Mr. Four. I don't, so I just have a question to follow up. I'm very grateful to know this. I was, last time in no way suggesting we're changing the legislative platform on the fly or changing what we address, but the 11 bills that I asked about last time, I have links to where I believe they're supported in our ledge platform. And so my question is, now, do I understand that I am just to send those to you as an individual, and then you as an individual take those to the mayor as an individual, and then she signs them? That's the process. Okay. So the 11 bills that I brought up last time, a lot of time has passed now. Do I still, I listed the reasons why I thought, but do I still need to now write an individual inquiry to you and then to the mayor?
No, Councilmember Stan, I have your list. And so we can, I'll be glad to follow up on those.
Okay, thank you. And so what would the timing on that be for?
Well, and I'll let Mr. Molinex jump in. I mean, currently the legislature's on recess, and he's done on, gratefully he's done some research on those specific bills on my behalf. So he can speak to that. In one of the emails I sent to you, I included his email specific to your bills, and so it gives you a status report of where they are. There's still time for the city to take an advocacy position on those.
Thank you. So that was an update on where the bills are in the legislature, but I think I'm asking about our internal processes about how we get a letter out. I just, for this, I understand SB9 and 10 are more sensitive, and I suppose there'll be questions on that after that part of the presentation, but some of these seem like, well, I'll write it out individually. And so if I were to then also talk to the mayor, is that what I also do to, when there's some bills here to support that would really be helpful for the city that I'm very frustrated we have not, as a city, have advocacy for that fit very squarely in our ledge platform. And I think this is very helpful. So the process is, I just want to be really, really clear, and for other council members as well, I don't believe we understand this process. It's to write to you, Mr. Four, and then we could also speak to the mayor directly in advocacy. And okay.
Sure. I mean, sure. The requests come in from any number of places. My take-home message here is ultimately they come to me. So they may come, you may speak to Paul, Casey, you may speak to others. Ultimately, they'll funnel to me, and and I'm glad to play that role. That's perfectly fine. And so I will help then draft letters. I will get those to the mayor to sign, and we'll distribute those to the appropriate legislators and committees.
Thank you. And then just a question on process. If it's unclear to you whether or not it fits in our legislative platform, then what happens?
Then I consult with others. I'll consult with the city attorney, and I'll consult with some other folks, and make sure that we're on solid ground before I do that.
Okay.
I'll say that's a fairly rare occurrence. There have been a handful of times where I've been very stumped with, ambiguity having to do with a bill after having based on such a robust legislative platform. It's fairly clear cut. But if there is ambiguity, and if I am unsure, I will go to Mr. Kalan and ask.
Thank you. And I do think it's a very thorough, I mean, we've approved it, and I've looked through every line of that legislative platform in the past as well. So then one more question. You mentioned that the mayor is empowered to sign letters that are consistent with the legislative platform. And I don't think this has ever happened, but if it should happen that the mayor does not agree, what happens then? It just does not get signed? Or is there a process for the city to show support?
That's a good question. It's never come up, so I don't know. I'll have to think about that, and let me talk to others. I'm not sure. It's a good question. Again, in my 10 years, it's never. There's certainly been a difference of opinion on the adoption of the platform and on the language of the platform. That's where we see those differences worked out, and there's a lot of discussion. There should be a lot of discussion on that. But once it's adopted, I personally have never, had an instance with two mayors now where they've said, no, I can't do that.
Fair enough. So if it's found that it's consistent with the legislative platform, and then you're bringing it forward and confirming that it's consistent, and then the process is to have it signed. Thank you so much. I've been writing letters myself and signing on to LA Times op-ed letters, and have really been looking forward to the process for the whole city moving forward. So thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Councilmember Sp9. And just to add, one is, that's an excellent question on what happens if a mayor or the council was split on an issue, that's something we can address in the fall meeting, just to have a policy in place just in case that happens. And then also, Mr. Four, if letters do get sent on any issue, could you make sure to copy the entire council so we know what letters are being sent out? Since a lot of these don't come to us individually, they're part of a request or part of a department that brings it forward, just so the council's informed of what letters are being sent into which legislators. That would be very helpful.
Yes.
So any further questions from my colleagues on this item? Hearing none, I will open it up to public comment. And is there any member of the public who wishes to speak to this item on the legislative platform itself, not any specific legislation? Please raise your hand in the app.
Mr. Chair, we have one speaker with their hand raised. Ms. Turley, if you'd like to speak on the legislative platform process and contents, please keep your hand raised. And if you're here to speak on other legislation, they'll be mentioned in the next item, please lower your hand. Mr. Chair, she still has her hand raised, so I'm going to
Call on Ms. Turley.
and let me move over to our clock here. All right, Ms. Turley, I'm going to unmute you, and then you can unmute yourself and begin speaking. Please go ahead. Ms. Turley, you can begin speaking.
So, can you hear me?
Just barely. Are you there, Ms.
Is that
Turley?
better? Is that better?
A little bit. Are you able to make it a little bit louder?
I'm at volume, sorry.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, so I am speaking in regards to the legislative committee. Am I speaking at the right time?
Yes, this is for the legislative committee platform. Specific legislation will be at the next item.
Okay, I'm going to speak at the next item. Sorry about any confusion.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Turley. We will look forward to hearing your comments at item 3. So with that, I will close public comment. And there's no action taken on this item. So I do want to thank you, Mr. Four, for putting this together, this presentation. Excellent questions from my colleagues. And we will look forward to having the meeting in the fall that will further refine the legislative platform updated and look at being more, having future meetings and how we can look at more strategic times and looking at that and have a full discussion on updating our processes and procedures as well. So unless are there any comments to this item from my colleagues? And if there aren't, we'll move on to item 2. Not seeing lights turned on. We will move on, Mr. Four. We will move on to item 3, which is a discussion of the priorities of legislative bills. You have.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just before we bring on Mr. Molinax, I wanted to clarify one more thing. And this is, the process discussion was a great segue to this item. We have with us today Mr. Dave Molinax from the California League of Cities. Mr. Molinax, you can come on. Mr. Molinax was kind enough to do a lot of tracking of specific bills for us. There are a couple of bills, and this is where I want to deviate from my own discussion on purpose of the platform. So as you can see, the platform, the 37 pages that comprise the legislative platform give the city all kinds of latitude to take advocacy positions on various bills. That said, there are some bills that are of such great social import or public interest or have such, far-reaching implications that even though the mayor could write an advocacy letter and may still do so on a particular bill, this committee may deem that they require additional discussion in a more open forum. So the way that the agenda has been written, Mr. Molinax is gonna speak to you and discuss a few high priority bills, including Senate Bills 9 and 10. And Senate Bill 9, as you're aware, has been in our local papers and has been, there's been quite a bit of interest about Sp9. And I want to make sure that this committee understands, what your options are. You can simply listen to Mr. Molinax's discussion, become more informed, ask questions. You're also empowered to refer any bills that you wish to the full council for further discussion. You're further empowered to refer those bills to the city council with a recommendation on a position for further discussion. So you're not compelled to do anything today other than listen and decide how you'd like to proceed. If you want to stay with our current practice, which again, I think works really well, just keep in mind that the authority to write a letter on a particular bill, any bill that you hear about today, that's consistent with the Ledge platform, we can do so, no questions asked. We already have a process in place. So I hope that keeps clear what I previously said about the purpose and process in relation to what Mr. Molinax will speak about today. So with that, I'm done talking. Mr. Molinax, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here and great to be before the council as well, council members on the committee. Just to set a little bit of context, I want to make sure everyone realizes this is the first year in a 2-year legislative cycle. The legislature is presently on break, and they will be on break until August 16th. And these are times where we get to kind of take a step back, look at what's happened up until now. They will come back on August 16th, and there'll be pretty much a sprint run to the finish to get through this legislative cycle. This has been a different year for a lot of reasons, obviously COVID, but also because of the unprecedented funds that are coming out of the federal government and through the state government. There's been a lot of time being addressed to make sure that our cities are able to access these funds and to make sure that you're able to meet the challenges in your community. So it's been kind of a unique legislative cycle. There were over 2,500 bills originally submitted this year, which is kind of crazy. There's still over 1,000 bills still at the legislature. Now, a lot of bills, including the list of bills that this committee was looking at earlier, most of those bills are actually got bumped into a 2-year bill, which means they made it out of their House of Origin. So an Assembly bill made it out of Assembly and went over to the Senate committee that's relevant to that bill, but it didn't get out of committee. So then that bill becomes a 2-year bill, and they'll take it up next year once the legislative session starts in 2022. Other bills that have fiscal impacts of over $50,000 get put in what's known as suspense or appropriations, and they just get stacked in this committee. And then when they come back from recess, those bills, the fiscal bills, the appropriations bills, they call it in suspense file, they get prioritized, and some bills make it out and go into the floor. And sometimes they have to go back to the House of Origin for some, if it gets amended, it has to go back to the original House and kind of reconciled with the other House. But a lot of bills don't make it out of suspense, and then they get bumped into a 2-year bill as well. So many bills basically kind of get kicked down the road, quite frankly. And you also see that, again, with the recall election being set in September, has also drawn a lot of focus away from some of these issues as well. Housing is always an issue up there in Sacramento, especially over the last several years. There have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bills that get submitted, hundreds of bills that become law. And quite frankly, a lot of these bills, they don't get a chance to see if they work. So they just kind of keep piling on these bills. And quite frankly, at the local level, sometimes we get overwhelmed and inundated because to keep track of exactly what these bills mean and interpreted what they mean locally. It's also a lot of bills that are, again, they're just piled on to bills that we still haven't realized whether the bills that were passed in the previous cycle are effective or work or cause problems. So housing has always been a challenge. I know there's several housing bills that your city is concerned about, including Sp9 and Sb10. Both of those bills, when they were first submitted, some people thought on the support side, they thought they were going to be kind of like magic bullets and panaceas to certain issues. And on the other side, they thought it was going to be catastrophe. Both bills have been watered down throughout the committee process, the legislative process, and both bills are going to floor vote. Both bills have a high likelihood of getting out and going to the governor's desk. Sp9, which is authored by the president of the Senate, she obviously a very powerful legislator and has a lot of juice getting this bill through the system. Sp9 is the lot split bill where you can take an existing lot and with some minor guidelines, you can split a lot and put another unit onto that lot. Now, the challenge is there's been several studies recently that basically say, even in the best case scenario, Sp9 would probably generate maybe at the very most 14,000 new units statewide, which is certainly not going to be in any way, shape, or form helping meet the challenge that the state of California has with getting affordable and low-income housing on the market. Sp9 is, again, has a high likelihood of getting out into the governor's desk. And again, once it gets out of, it's in the Senate, it's in the Assembly right now, it'll go to the governor's desk, and that may give you one more chance to either lobby the governor for or against the bill. And with letters, and again, I always say letters and phone calls from our local elected officials are always effective. They do make a difference, but what is even more effective is when we can get third-party groups in your community, whether it's business groups, community groups, labor groups, on board these lobbying efforts as well, makes the advocacy efforts much more effective. And it's very hard for our senators or assembly members to ignore or try to avoid those type of multifaceted lobbying efforts. So it's always a good thing to try to get our communities involved, our leaders involved, people that have relationships with our elected officials involved as well in these advocacy efforts. So Sp9 has a very good chance of getting out into the governor's desk. It's not going to be nearly as either effective or as onerous, depending on where you come out on this bill, as initially thought. A lot of times it's only going to be effective on the lot splits. It has to be mostly empty lots, and there's not a lot of empty lots in a lot of cities in California. Or it's got to be on a lot with a house that has a huge lot. And quite frankly, there's not a lot of cities out there that that's the case as well. So that means, again, that's why some of these studies, even the best case scenario, this is going to generate maybe 14,000 homes statewide. Sb10 is another bill, similar dynamics. Senator Wiener is the author. Originally, again, depending on whether you support or oppose, there was going to be, if you support the bill, you thought it was going to be more of a panacea to certain types of infill challenges. And if you were opposed to it, you thought it was going to be, you know, a catastrophe. Well, again, the bill has been watered down through the legislative process. It's an opt-in, it's totally optional type of bill. It allows for cities to forego a full CEQA process when you upzone in those areas. So again, it's not going to do a whole lot. It really is one of those things where if a city wants to do it, they can do it. And quite frankly, the kind of a secret behind Sb10 was a city could probably do that anyway. So this bill is, again, it's one of these things that best intentioned by the senator in the beginning or worse intentions, depending on where you come out on this bill, it really got watered down, and it's really not going to have a dramatic or even a nominal effect here at the local level. So I know those two are the bills that are the most concerned, that get a lot of attention, and they've gotten a lot of attention over the last several years. But again, the legislative process does that. You know, you go through, you make some concessions, you make some compromises, and a lot of times the bill has a lot less juice at the final product than when it had in the original writing of the construction of the bill. Most of those other housing bills, again, like I said, are either in 2-year bills or or in a suspense file. The other two that I know that your city was really interested in was the SB12 and SB55, which has to do with fire resilience zones. Senator Hannibal Jackson a few years ago had a bill that's very similar to SB12 that actually made it through the process and got to the governor's desk. And then certain special interests got a hold of the governor and he vetoed the bill. SB12 from Senator McGuire, is very much similar to that Hannibal Jackson bill. That bill looked like it had gotten out of the Senate, obviously, and over in the Assembly and in committee the other day. It was just this past week. Again, special interest got a hold of some members and it got bottled up, and it is now a 2-year bill as well. The difference between SB12 and SB55 as far as the fire resilience stuff is Stern's bill of SB55 prevents any building at all in those fire zone, hazard zones. I can't remember the exact nomenclature of it. But in SB12 allows some building, but with some guidelines and some provisions to try to make sure that, that some precautions are taken when we are doing some development in those zones. So SB12 is probably more of the compromise. It's very much along the lines of the Hannibal Jackson bill that was, again, vetoed by the governor a few years ago. And it looked like it was going to get out, but it didn't. The SB55 really never had a lot of juice behind it. That's the Senator Stern bill, who's a senator down in Ventura County and parts of LA. It really never had a lot of momentum at all. And again, special interests bottled that up very quickly. And again, it will be a 2-year bill, probably isn't going to be going very far. The SB12 does have potential, but once again, we'll see next year. A lot of things can happen between now and then, obviously. And again, what I would say is we're going to be having another legislative briefing by the Channel Counties Division on some of these priority bills as we get closer to the recess being concluded and doing that sprint to the finish line, and would encourage city council members and staffers to join us for that as well. Councilmember Harmon is the chair of that committee, and we can take up any bills that your city would like to see. And I'll be happy to answer any other questions on any of the bills. I know those were the main ones. I don't want to just sit here and listen to myself talk, but I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Molnix. Appreciate you being here today. And open up for questions. I'll start with Councilmember Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Thank you, Mr. Molnix. And thank you for these updates. Again, I suppose, Chair Friedman, this shows my frustration with I would have liked to have written a letter of support for SB12. It looked like it was going to get out, and letters of support are just as important, if not more important, I think, than our letters against. So I'm disappointed we did not as a group support SB12. I have a question about SB 15 and for rezoning for big boxes, retail sales, and how retail sites, sorry, how is that progressing through and what those impacts are? So that's one question. And then I have some, I guess, detailed questions about the current, you said watered down, but some of those current changes to SB9. But first, a question about SB15, how that's going.
SB15 is from Anthony Portantino down there in the LA area. It allows local governments to get grants from the state to convert those empty commercial buildings into low income and affordable housing. It is also a 2-year bill. And again, SB12, I understand your disappointment. What I would say is it is a 2-year bill. We do have another shot at it. There were some very powerful interests that probably was going to block it one way or another. And so I don't know if any of our efforts at that moment would have done much to change it. But again, we do have another bite at the apple next year. And I do think it has a chance, much more so than SB55. SB15 definitely has a chance. Portantino is the second in the Senate. The chair of the Housing Committee in the Senate. And so he has a lot of sway on these bills. And has a lot, he knows how to build coalitions and get the message out. I think that one definitely has a chance. And again, it will provide grants for local governments to help do those redevelopments.
That would be huge for us. I mean, we have Macy's, Nordstrom, Sears, and if we can get funding to help transform those into affordable housing, which is what we want to happen, I think we really want to go after those funds. I think that fits in with our platform. Thank you. And then so SB9, I have a couple questions about that. Was the high fire carve out achieved? Is that in the latest iteration of the bill?
I do believe so. You know what? Let me make sure about that. I was paying more attention to the dynamics of what was going on with some of the lot split part of the stuff. I do believe you're correct on that, and I will pass that information along to Mr. Ford.
Okay, thank you. I think, my concern, we'll save this for discussion too, but most of what you said, it applies to larger lots. Most of our larger lots are directly in the interface with the wildfire urban interface and wildland urban interface, and it are really affected by increased development and concentration of those zones. And I guess we can save that for discussion too, but I was also wondering if there was any discussion of a carve out for steep hillsides over 14%, or if you're lot splitting and increasing the density, or any extra discussion there on mitigation fees or impact fees for what that would do to our infrastructure.
I will call our lobbyist on that, because again, that bill has changed dramatically since it was first submitted. And most of it had to do whether how many units could be on the new lot, the new split lot. And that was really what was garnering most of the attention and the headlines and press. I will communicate the carve out, and because again, I'm quite aware of your particular city's issues on that, and I'll make sure you get that answer today.
Thank you. And that's, I guess that would be my question also on sort of the generic letter, which is great if we could add portions directly addressing it's really the high fire zones that are can't handle this added, nearly doubling or quadrupling of the density there. So thank you. Those are my questions for now. Thank you, Mr. Molinak.
Thank you, Councilmember Stin. And just a reminder of the discussion now is, Mr. Molinax, we as individual council members can reach out to you as well with your contact information to get, if there's a specific bill we're following as individuals or on behalf of a group, to reach out to you to get that information or new information, to get the latest updates to convey to the public as well. So you're willing and ready to hear from us at any time as individuals, right, Mr. Molinax?
Absolutely, and always encourage that. And again, it's always good for our elected officials to be engaged and also to get your communities engaged in the process. So absolutely, anytime.
And Mr. Ford, we'll make sure that all the council members have Mr. Molinax's contact information, so we can, they're aware they can reach out to him on any bills that might be of interest to now or in the future as well. So any other further questions at this point? Not hearing any, I will open it up to public comment. So are there members of the public who wish to speak to this agenda item? I believe there are. I know Ms. Turley's up there. So Mr. Ford, if you can call public comments.
Yeah, it's gonna be 1 second, Mr. Chair. Okay, so we have a few folks here. I see a couple hands up. If you'd like to speak on this item, please raise your hand in the GoToWebinar app. So far, we have Ian Balke and Mary Turley. So Mr. Balke, I'm gonna start with you. I'm gonna unmute you. You can then unmute yourself and begin speaking.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for this discussion. I think it's really important. I just kind of want to call in and ask that you really seriously consider kind of the other side of these issues when it comes to SB9 and SB10. The SB9, the California Home Act, I'll speak on first. I know everyone's hearts are in the right place. I know you all support more affordable housing and more housing opportunities, but I think that in the conversations we've had, especially in this community, there has been a lot of mischaracterization about what this bill actually says. And from my understanding, I did some light reading, actually went through the bill over the past couple of days, and I don't see really the big issues when you consider the exemptions, and I think that there are some really needed improvements here. One example is just the environmental aspect of having single family zoning. The Oregon Department of Environmental Quality did a study and found that on a block with 18 homes, if you convert just 3 of those homes into a triplex, you can reduce the block's carbon footprint by nearly 20% just with the increased density. I think that's really important considering we have such limited land use in our city. I'm looking at the Senate or the Assembly Housing Committee's analysis. It says that this exempts high fire zones, environmentally sensitive areas like coastal zones, historic districts. That's a majority of the city of Santa Barbara. The bill empowers local governments like ours to add inclusionary requirements. I think that's a really important aspect to consider there. I'm not sure where Mr. Molnex gets his information about 14,000 units statewide. The bill authors claim up to 800,000 units statewide. It definitely does not solve the inclusionary housing crisis, but I think it is really important for us to mitigate the impacts of exclusionary zoning, which is what single family zoning is. You can impose objective design, parking, zoning standards. You can limit ADUs despite what some people are claiming. Some people have even claimed that this bill allows the creation of 8 to 10 units. That's not the case. The bill lets you limit it. I have a lot more to say on this that I'm not going to get through with my time here, but I will also say with SB10 in particular, I just don't think it's credible to say that SB10, you hear a lot that quote, these bills harm local control. I get the argument with SB9, but SB10 does not limit local control in any way. It's an optional ordinance. Our general plan, the transportation element, says that having an automobile should be a choice, not a necessity. So when other localities are ready with high transit areas to move in that direction, we shouldn't get in the way and limit the tools that they have available to them. So I know it's a lot to ask you to support SB9, considering kind of the contentiousness of it, but I really, really don't think it makes sense for the city to actively oppose SB10 especially. I have a lot more here. I'd really ask you to look into the groups that are supporting these bills, like Habitat for Humanity California, American Planning Association, County Monterey, the YIMBY groups, Urban Environmentalists, Bay Area Association of Government, Local Government Commission. Yeah, I'm up. So that's all. And Santa Barbara League of Women Voters as well. But thank you, and please really consider the pros of these bills as well.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our next speaker is Mary Turley. Mary, I'm going to unmute you and then you can begin. There you go. Ms.
Okay.
Turley, you should be able to speak.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. And I do want to go back a little bit and just say thank you, Matt, for that great presentation, because it really cleared up some questions. And thank you, City Council members who are on this committee for meeting. And I just want to bring forward at a recent RENA meeting that the city staff had said that we had sufficient zoning capacity for the upcoming requirements, the next cycle 6, which is due to the new ADU laws and the recent AUD local zoning changes. In addition, we're in the process of updating our multifamily housing program to provide more housing. More housing is coming down the line. I'm here to talk about local control. We have it in our platform to put out a letter on this, and I urge you to do that. I also want to bring up that East Side and the West Side have some older housing that could be on larger lots. And these types of lots are just prime for developers to come in, and they don't have to be next door. They could be hopscotch through the community. I also live in an area of the Mesa, and my two next door neighbors have very large lots. And we are in the coastal high fire zone. And I have not seen text yet in SB9. And there's a lot of confusion, and no one has come up with the exact text that shows that the high fire zones will be excluded. The other thing is they tend to focus on the extreme high fire zones. Well, I'm in the coastal high fire zone, and I evacuated from the Loma fire, and we've had other fires in the almost 40 years that I've lived here. And I have seen developers come in, tear down houses, or rehab the existing and build next door. And these are not units occupied by people who already live and work in Santa Barbara, and I have examples of that. So I just urge you to get more information about the details on SB9, but I also think you should just write that letter to retain local control. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Turley, for your comments. Are there any more speakers, Mr. Ford?
Let me take a look, Mr. Chair. Nobody else has their hand raised. Let me just do one final call. If any attendees wish to speak on this item, please raise your hand in the GoToWebinar app. And there are no hands raised, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so I will close public comment. So now we're going to go on to discussion. And so we have a few different options today, as Mr. Ford explained on what to do. We specifically in regards to Senate Bills 9 and 10, we have the options we could refer to council for a full discussion, or we could take action today to have letters sent on behalf of the council in regards to our legislative platform signed by the mayor. That is an option for us today as well. And we can also look at any of the language we want to have included in those. And if there are any additional bills that have come up that you would like to have Mr. Ford look at, feel free to raise those, and Mr. Ford can look at those and look at the legislative platform that has come up. And as we begin our discussions, I do appreciate the public comment today, but I'll start by saying that in regards to Senate Bill 9 and 10, I am supportive of sending a letter today in opposition to both of those. I understand their arguments in favor of them, but I think one, that it's consistent with our legislative platform to maintain local control. It's found on page 24 of the legislative platform specifically, and it gives us our autonomy. And specifically in our city, we have a lot of changes that we're grappling with our community here that we're working through. We have the ADU, we have the AUD, we're looking at, the FAR, 4 area ratios. And we're also looking at different types of zoning in our city. So there's a lot of changes that are going on, and our community is very engaged. And to have the ability to do it with our community would be in our best interest. And another concern I have is that as bills become law, that the state, such as Sp10, which is a voluntary opt-in, that if you don't opt in, it could raise some flags. That has happened in the past where it is kept track of who opts in and who doesn't. So those are all concerns down the line. And for me also, as well as once you upzone properties or you change those properties, it's very difficult to go back. So I think there's too many questions right now to make that change. So I'm supportive of sending a letter today from the recommendation from the Ledge Committee, but I'd like to hear from my colleagues. And then specifically, there's another bill that came up outside of this, and I'd just like to refer it to Mr. Ford. There were going to be some speakers today, but had told me, but they sent a letter. It's regarding to federal legislation. It's the revenue neutral, carbon free, and dividend legislation. I had forwarded the correspondence to Mr. Ford, and it's within our legislative platform as well on page 20 to support such federal legislation. So I just want to refer that to you, Mr. Ford, to verify that and see if that is something that we can take. And my understanding is we did take that position with previous councils a few years back, but because that had come up in regards to this meeting, there was letters sent behind that. I just wanted to put that on the record that it came in regards to this meeting, and just forwarding it on to you for the consideration. So with that, I don't have any further comments, but on SB9, 10, and that specific one, but now open it up to my colleagues, and I see Councilmember Harmon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. And thank you very much to Mr. Four and Mr. Mullinex for this presentation. I think you and I, Mr. Chair, are in very similar places. And so I think I'll be able to be very brief. I'm going to start with Sp9. I agree that I would very much support us sending a letter in opposition to this bill. Again, understanding and recognizing that there may be some positives statewide, it really is painted far too broadly for our community. I would like to add, if possible, and perhaps Mr. Mullinex will have an answer for us about what specifically has been exempted or excluded, but I would like within our letter for us to note that it's of particular importance to us that there is an exemption for not just very high fire zones, but I believe it was Ms. Turley who brought up the coastal high fire zone. Or, you know, I think that is really vital for our community, and that's sort of the crux, one of the major cruxes of my concern with that bill. So our letter, I would hope very much, not only would it state our opposition in terms of us needing to really retain control over our own housing policies, and perhaps to reflect that we are actively trying to create policy that will facilitate sustainable housing that works for the city of Santa Barbara, and to convey our opposition in that light, but to also state that in the event this bill does move forward, this is a very serious health and safety concern for our neighbors. And I maintain the position that while it's very important for us to communicate our opposition or support for a given bill, it's also important for us to communicate why we have opposition and what we would really like to see changed. So for me, I think reference to the fire exemption is very important to me, and I would like to see that at least referenced in the letter. So to the extent it's not already included very clearly as an exemption. And then as to Sb10, I'm willing to send a letter in opposition to that as well. I'm a bit more agnostic on that bill, I have to admit, because of the opportunity for our city to opt in or out, and perhaps, and I apologize, I didn't ask this earlier, but perhaps Mr. Mullinex could come back in and just briefly address this concern that there may be knock-on effects for our community if we decide to opt out of the Sb10 regulation. Do you anticipate that there will be consequences for cities that opt out more broadly? In which case, if that's true, I agree, Mr. Friedman, with your position that it makes good sense for us to oppose that, not knowing what those consequences might be down the road. It seems quite an open-ended, potentially challenging situation for us. But if it's not clear that that'll have consequences down the road, I guess I just sort of circle back to I'm not sure how much passion this one ignites in me, as opposed to Sb10, which is, or Sp9, excuse me, which I think has some major concerns. I again am open to it, to writing a letter of opposition on Sb10 as well, but I would just like confirmation that we do anticipate there will be some consequences down the line if a municipality chooses to opt out. If there's no consequences, then I'm not sure that it's totally necessary, but open to where my colleagues are on that one. All right, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Mullinex, if you could come on just to address that point. Sorry, council members, then it was specifically to the deliberations. So,
you know, as council member said mentioned those carve outs, and I do know that there are carve outs. I wanted to be really specific when speaking of those. And again, these bills have changed over the weeks, and there are carve outs that probably impact a city like Santa Barbara more so than most cities. Let me find out the exact exemptions that bill carries, and I will be forthcoming with my specific answers to your committee this afternoon. But again, it impacts probably those type of exemptions impact your city more than most, which is, again, I apologize for not having all the details on that. Again, the dynamics of that bill were mostly concerned about how many units could be put on the lot split. And, but I'll get that information to you right after the meeting.
Thank you. And Mr. Mullinex, one more quick question on Sb10. If and you may not know the answer to this, so apologies if it's a question that is unanswerable, but if a community chooses to opt out of the ordinance making under SB10, do you anticipate there will be consequences down the road, other consequences for communities? Does it signify something that may implicate funding or other types of constraints for opting out? Will there be any consequences for saying no?
I don't believe so now. Most of it is you can opt in if you'd like, and quite frankly, you could probably do what the bill wants you to do without SB10 already. I understand, the senator has been having a certain approach of his bill. The bill, though, again, as Councilmember Freeman did right out, the only concern I would think about cities is once you do upzone, it's incredibly hard to downzone if that's the way your city wants to do it. There are cities that are going to take this option. I wouldn't imagine a lot of cities will, but again, this is when he first wrote the bill, it was constructed in a much different fashion than the end result is. And again, the League of California Cities doesn't even have a position on this bill because it really just doesn't do a whole lot. And the cities that want to do that, that's great. And the cities that don't want to do that, they're going to not do that because they feel it's infringement on local land use authority.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Molnix. Thank you, Councilmember Harmon. And Councilmember Snet, you have the floor. We're all set, Mr. Molnix. You can turn your camera off.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. So I'll speak first to SB9, and then I want to make sure that I mention, again, those other bills, just to make sure they're in the queue for consideration. But for SB9 in particular, I have a couple concerns that I think need to, in addition, be addressed. I mean, one, we've talked about, we have the zoning to meet the capacity requirements for the RENA numbers. And actually, we have more than the zoning requirements to meet our RENA capacity requirements. And we have now our ADUs, and those are mandated by the state, but we also have incentives for AUDs. We're considering incentives and added consideration for FAR, Florida area ratios. And these are all to incentivize our housing downtown in the urban core. And everything that we know about climate change and increased wildfire risk in these hillside areas tells us to move density away from these sensitive areas and move them away from the wildland wildfire urban interface. And so this bill, SB9 in particular, seems to incentivize increasing densities away from the urban core and toward those climate change sensitive areas in the high fire. So it's not just the fire risk itself, but it's the movement away from our local control on incentivizing housing in the downtown core. I'm also really concerned that this bill does not come with inclusionary provisions, and with all that we're trying to do to increase our inclusionary housing in the downtown core, this would provide developers an opportunity to build away from that downtown core without that inclusionary provision. So it's actually acts as an incentive to not build in the downtown core. The large lots that Mr. Molinax was referring to, those are in the hillsides. So that's one issue of local control, is that we really are trying to choose carefully with a lot of public input, with council consideration of where we're incentivizing this housing. And this takes that away from us, not just the control, but our ability to create incentives for where we do want it. It de-incentivizes for where we're actually trying to focus. So that's one issue. My real concern also, though, is not just with high fire, but with the hillsides. And we haven't talked too much about that. And it happens that most of our high fire, extreme high fire, does coincide with our hillside design district. which is defined as having 14% slopes or greater. And my concern here is that in those sloping, high slope areas, our hillside district, we are more prone to debris flows. And we have, as a city, experienced the devastating impacts of wildfire, debris flow, and the impacts of those hillsides. And we are at a particular risk for that because of our geology. And these are things that are nuanced and very specific to our city, but that's how this type of housing bill should be. And I think that needs to be mentioned in the letter that I completely support, opposing SB9, that it's not just looking at a city as just a flat, two-dimensional plane. We have, we're landlocked by that wildland urban interface, our 14% slope hillsides, and then our sensitive coastal zone. So within that downtown core is really where we want to incentivize that housing. So a consideration of those hillsides, the 14% slope, and our particular geology that makes us prone to that type of impact from the burden of overdevelopment in those areas. And then my third concern is that this bill does not come with any mitigation or impact fees. And I don't think that it is fair, and it's an oversight that development of this scale that could potentially happen in those hillside districts seriously burdens not just the roads. Roads are more impacted in hillside areas, but also our water and sewage infrastructure. So if you do have a lot split and then ADUs, and so you're taking from 1 unit to 4 units, even though it appears that that's a large lot, plenty of room to do that development, if then you take into consideration that it's on a slope of 14%, that up here at the boundary is the wildfire interface, and the added pressure that puts on our sewage infrastructure and our water pumping up to those developments on the hillside. Those are impacts that have just not been emphasized, but that there's also no mitigation fee or any way to offset those fiscal impacts to the city. So those would be, added costs and burdens to our city infrastructure and funding for those. So I think there's a variety of reasons. We absolutely need affordable housing. And I think as a city, we're acting very proactively to incentivize that. And SB9 just takes that away and actually incentivizes away from the downtown core where we're trying to incentivize. So that's on SB9. SB10, I'm also with Councilmember Harmon. We can be in opposition to it, but since it's an opt-in bill, I think that rests on us. And I'm okay if we don't write a letter, but we might as well write a letter. It's really our SB9. I want it to have that added consideration of the hillside design district that we have. And then also concerns with the coastal wildfire. With our new wildfire mitigation plan, we had some discussion about whether those coastal wildfire zones would retain extreme fire or high fire hazard area designation. So that would be something I think that's important to discuss with Councilmember Jordan. He I believe was supportive of removing those designations. So that might be something that to consider that as well in the coastal zone. So I'm just very opposed to SB9, not just because it's we need the affordable housing, but this isn't the way to get it for us here locally in Santa Barbara. So then just to reiterate, I think I mentioned them last time and ones to look at, and I will follow up with Mr. Four now that process is really complete in there. I do think it's clearly in our legislative platform to support SB 15. That's the rezoning of retail sites, and that would allow us to grant funding and help us with streamlining the redevelopment of our Sears, Nordstrom, Macy's buildings into housing, affordable housing. So that one seems like a clear support that we could give to SB15. I understand SB55 is idle and that the others have moved into a 2-year cycle, but I think it's a real opportunity to show our support of housing, and it's in the areas where we want it, with a letter of support for SB15 as well. And then of course SB12 with the wildfire planning. We have already made our wildfire protection plan, so we're already primed. This is something that encourages jurisdictions to create those plans. We have ours, and it's a beautiful plan, and we should be supporting that plan, and a letter of support with SB12 would help with that as well. So I just want to leave it at that those are the main ones that I think today we could support and have letters written and get those out there. Thank you, Chair Fagan.
Thank you, Councilmember Stettin. So now we need to come up with a motion. So what I heard was from my colleagues was send a letter today in opposition to SB9, include additional language specifically stating our concerns with it, including fire language relating to high fire zones, hillsides, including moving density towards the urban core and not incentivizing it outside, especially in these high fire zone and other areas. And an inclusionary, like to see inclusionary provisions in there, as well as mitigation fees for impacts to infrastructure and other types of things. SB10, although we're lukewarm to it, we could do an opposition letter to it. And just to reiterate, one of my concerns that I brought up, that I do agree with my colleagues on it since it is voluntary, but I am concerned that eventually down the road, the state will look at, was it who opted in and who didn't, and it could come back. It's the first step down the road. So it's something down the line that I'm concerned with, but if we could send a letter of opposition today in regards to it, even though it is optional at this time. And then in terms of a motion, we have those, and then there are these other bills. If we'd like to include SB 15 and 12 to recommend as a letter of support, as well as HR 2307 in regards to the carbon revenue neutral carbon fee. Those are there, but we can either refer those to staff and have them write letters there, or we can specifically, we do need to vote on 9 and 10. So entertaining a motion at this point. Councilmember Stettin.
So moved. I think you reiterated really nicely the summary of the added considerations for SB9. So I would like to move that we write the letters for SB9 with those added considerations, and SB10, and then SB12, SB15, and HR 2307.
Great. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, may I have a roll call, please?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. This is a motion by Committee Member Sneddon, seconded by Committee Member Harmon, to take a number of actions. The first is to write a letter in opposition of SB9 with language specific to driving density to the downtown core and away from the urban wildland interface, or excluding fire zones, including inclusionary provisions, mitigation fees for city infrastructure. Writing a second letter in opposition to SB10, writing letters related to SB 15 and SB 12, and also HR 2307 related to the carbon dividend measure. Okay. So
in SB9, Mr. Ford, I believe you mentioned high fire mitigation fees, but I'm not sure you mentioned the hillside.
Oh, sorry, the slopes of 14%.
The slopes of 14% and greater. Thank you.
Yes. Indeed, got it. Okay, I will take a roll call vote. Committee Member Harmon,
Yes.
Committee Member Sneddon,
Yes, and thank you.
and Chair Friedman.
Yes. Great, passes unanimously. Thank you. So that brings us to the conclusion of our agenda. And then just as a reiteration, we will get back to my colleagues on finding a date in the fall to look at the legislative platform and any updates we might want to begin that process, and then look at how we can look at our own processes for reviewing state legislation that will be in the fall. So with that, this meeting of the Legislative Committee is adjourned. Thank you.